I left Kent State University Press, it was my pleasure and privilege to work with Rona Simmons on her book that she's going to talk about today, the Other Veterans of World War II. I'm just going to give a brief bio so she can get to the program. This is her bio from the book. Rona has written both novels and works of historical fiction. She co-authored Images from World War II, celebrating the art of World War II veteran and artist Jack Smith. Rona is the daughter of a World War II fighter pilot herself. She is proud to honor veterans and their stories through her work. Her stories, articles, and interviews have appeared in regional and national literary journals and online magazines. So please give a warm Rotary welcome to our guest, Rona Simmons.
Thank you, Will, very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I appreciate having another Zoom meeting. I know we all wish they would go away and be able to be face-to-face, but it does allow me to meet with you here today. So, and thank you especially to Will. He was instrumental in bringing my book to fruition, so I am eternally grateful. I always enjoy talking about my book, but mostly it's about the veterans that I met and came to know in the 3+ year project to bring the book to the public. I'm going to take you back not 100 years, but 75 years to the end of the Second World War. And I'm going to share my screen. This is always the toughest part. Let me see if I can do that. And there we go. There, I hope, can everyone see the screen? Am I? Okay, great, thank you. So the other veterans, I'm going to take you back, as I said, 70+ years to the end of the Second World War, when men and women like those you see here boarded the ships to come home from the war. There were 10 million of them, and it was a major undertaking to get them all back. But they boarded those ships and stood on deck, pilots next to tank drivers, soldiers, sailors, Marines, fighter pilots, and of course, mechanics, cooks, medics, nurses, radio men, all of them side by side on the ships. And when they came home, they went back to work and to school, took off their uniforms, put back on their civvies, and most of them, like my father and those I've spoken with, never spoke again about their service, or if they did, it was years later. And to a person, they would really say, if you asked them what they did, they would most likely say they just did their duty. And it's whether it was their duty or that they did nothing special. And it's those veterans today that are pictured here, the 19 that I interviewed for this project, who served behind the lines, that I'm going to talk about and hopefully give you a different perspective on the war. Some of these people served stateside, some of them just feet behind the front lines, and some halfway around the world in the Gobi Desert. They never saw the spotlight. And as I said, they would say they did nothing special, but I hope by the time I'm through that you'll see they are indeed very special. And let's see if I can actually make this work. Go to the next slide. Sorry. Well, we're going to have a little trouble here. So we can get it this way. Okay, thank you. Sorry, always a glitch. One of the first people I met in this project was Francis D. Peterson, better known as Pete Peterson. He was a lieutenant colonel when he retired in the US Army. But when the war broke out, he was somewhat unusual. He decided, of course, to serve and to do his duty, to enlist, but he really didn't care what he was going to do. And he ended up in the Quartermaster Corps, who is responsible for a number of things, everything from doing laundry to feeding the troops, and his role in graves registration. Now, I don't know about you, but I knew nothing about graves registration until I got to know Pete through his daughter and the memoir that he wrote. The Quartermaster Corps and the graves registration, these people were those who followed behind Patton and the other generals across Europe, across the Pacific, and retrieved the dead after the battles, identified their found their identities from their remains and then buried them. They also engineered cemeteries with great pride, as Pete Peterson attested in his memoir. Geometry was his favorite subject in school, and he was determined when he found himself not in the bakery or the laundry, but in graves registration, that he would honor the fallen through the respect that he gave in creating the cemeteries, using his geometry to create perfect rows and align the graves and make perfect corners to the cemeteries. He also had to make sure that they captured the identities and made meticulous records about where the people were buried. Because one thing I didn't know when I started this, that there were over 350 cemeteries across Europe alone after the end of the war. And when the war ended, the US allowed the families to decide whether their sons or daughters were going to be left overseas or whether they wanted their remains to be brought home. And actually what they had to do, of course, with those records is be able to find who was buried where. And what ended up, as probably many of you know, the American cemeteries today, there are 29 of them across the globe, but we had to get from 350 down to that group, much smaller group of 29 across the globe. And so Pete was very instrumental in making that happen and being able to return the remains to their loved ones. But he also, interestingly, as gruesome as his task was, he carried his camera with him to war. And I thought that was very interesting that he would have that time, but I think it may have been a necessary break that he needed. He went on side trips. He made sure he saw all of the sites from Paris to Hitler's private home in Berchtesgaden in the Alps, took pictures where everyone, he has a wonderful album, a photo album that he left behind. And he also took great pride in looking after his men. Those in graves registration were given unlimited cigarettes and whiskey supplies. Now, the cigarettes may not be so important to us today, but the whiskey certainly was, and we can understand that. And he made sure they had everything that they wanted because of the terrible duty they had during the day. And we might think of this as, again, as most people do of non-combat veterans, as not really very dangerous duty, but in fact it was. Oftentimes the Germans would leave the bodies booby-trapped, or they would be strafed. And he said, we dove into the open graves that we had when they were strafed overhead by German fighters. And he was also a part of what's known as Little Pearl Harbor, when we lost 1,000 men on ships in Rome when they were strafed by Germans and bombed by Germans. And one of our ships was carrying chemical weapons, and they exploded, killing many, many people. It's become known as the Little Pearl Harbor because of the numbers of deaths there. And he was instrumental also in again, retrieving the dead from that incident. Well, Pete's story was really interesting to me because it revealed a part of the war that I didn't know. We're all familiar, of course, with Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, and the signing of the end of the war. But when we start thinking about the other veterans of World War II, the supply officers, the mechanics, the nurses, the truck drivers, those pictures and those people are much less well known to all of us. And when I started out, I realized that this was possibly because most people think of the non-combat veterans as having a sort of boring duties, that they were unimportant. After all, they were just mechanics and cooks, chaplains, truck drivers, or, as of course I learned as I read the much more pejorative terms, pencil pushers, desk jockeys, and worse, that we won't even talk about here today. But I was convinced that that image was false, and that in 2017 set out to meet the numbers of them, although I worried I wouldn't be able to find them. And I did my research to find out just how many there might have been. And if you look at the top left of your screen, you'll see that in 1940, just prior to the war, the population in the US was 133 million people. And that was relatively evenly split between men and women. So we had 66 million men back then. And the first peacetime draft that occurred in October 1940, of the 66 million men in the United States, 50 million ended up registering for the draft or were required to register. And of those 50 million, in the bottom left of your screen, you'll see that 16 million men and women served. A vast majority, of course, men, because women were not allowed to join the military, were prohibited, of course, from being in the draft. So you'll see the little tiny at the bottom of your left of your screen, the little pink legs on the last man in the 16 million. That represents the number of women who eventually served in the military, 400,000 women. So of the 16 million that served, 10 million were drafted and 6 million volunteered. And of those 10 million, of those 16 million on the bottom right, I discovered that, in fact, 60% or 6 million were combat soldiers and 10 million were combat soldiers and 6 million were non-combat. So my concerns about not being able to find anybody to talk to were allayed by this research. But then I thought, well, how did all of these people get to be assigned to their jobs, whether it was combat or non-combat? And it took a year or more before our numbers rose. And again, the draft occurred in October 1940. And by the end of 1941, nearing the date of Pearl Harbor, we still only had about 500,000 people in our armed forces. And that compared to 10 million in the German and Japanese armies. So when Pearl Harbor hit, people rushed to join up. And here again, they all stood in line, their brill cream in their hair and their Sunday best to enlist. And that helped move the needle, but we still needed to have the draft up. As you saw earlier, it was instrumental to have both avenues to join. But people rushed to join for a number of reasons. One, of course, that they were patriotic and wanted to do their duty, but they also had learned that if they enlisted, they would have their choice of service. They could go into the Navy or the Army Air Corps. And many of them, almost to a person you asked, they wanted to join to become a pilot. But they soon learned that you're in the Army now, and even though you enlisted, it was not necessarily going to be your choice. The Army had 550 positions to fill. Alone, and of course the same amount for the Marines or the Navy. But of those 550 positions, in order to allot people to the right assignment, what they decided was to keep the training time down and morale of our troops up. It would be best if they could draft someone and put them in a position that was most closely aligned with their civilian occupation before they came into the military. And so a bricklayer might be assigned to the Corps of Engineer. The longshoremen were by and large sent to the Quartermaster Corps, and police and detectives, it was logical to send them to the military police. But then they had to deal with the fact that they needed artists, actually artists on the rolls of the Army, bakers, saddle and harness makers, and my favorite, pigeoneer. Now, I've never met anyone who was actually a pigeoneer, but I'm looking for them. So if you find them, you let me know. People had to be assigned to these positions. And so that's how they ended up finding their assignment in non-combat or combat. And I interviewed over 19 non-combat men and women over the period of a couple of years prior to documenting their stories. They were just 19 of 16 million, so a very, very small sample to be sure. But I was very fortunate that I was able to meet people who represented a broad cross-section of the armed forces. Everything from the different theaters of war, at least the major theaters of war, the Asia Pacific, China, Burma, India, those who served stateside and those who served in Europe. They also represented all of the major branches of the military, from the Army to the Army Air Forces, the Navy Waves, the Army Nurse Corps, Merchant Marine, Civil Air Patrol, the Psycho Navy, which many people have not heard about, and one woman who worked for the Manhattan Project. So I had vowed when I started that if I was going to sit down and talk to a 90-plus-year-old about their service in the war, I was going to find a story. I was not going to spend the time with them and then decide to turn them down. So I luckily found a very good group of people to talk about. So one more story that I'd like to share with you, in sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, from Pete Peterson, was Lewis Thompson. Lewis was a corporal in the U.S. Army. Actually, when I met him, I said, well, what did you do? Because every time I went to interview someone, I wanted to make sure that they were a non-combat soldier. And he said, I was a high-flying buck private. And that's what he was. He turns out, was one of Georgia's most highly decorated veterans, but he ended up serving in the China-Burma-India theater from 1943 to 1945. Now, Lewis was a little bit different than some of the others. He did not want to go. He admitted, he said he wanted to go to college, and he was waiting to receive his college acceptance letter in the mail when he said a very different letter came. And that was from the military. And as he says, it said, your friends and neighbors have decided that you would make a great military person. So that was his draft letter, as he said. And he found himself shipped off to the China-Burma-India Theater, Burma in particular, where he was assigned to help build rebuild the Lido Road, or the Burma Road, that the Japanese had cut off our channel of supplies, where we were supplying the Chinese at that point in time, and through the Burma Road was shut down, as well as the ports into Japan. So he was in the jungle in miserable conditions, leeches, he mentions, monkeys, just terrible mud everywhere he looked. And so he did the unthinkable. When one of the officers came by and asked for volunteers, he raised his hand. And we all know that's the worst thing you can do. Well, he decided anything to get a warm, dry bed, no matter what they asked him to do. And he found himself as what he described as a kicker. And these are guys who flew in the back of C-47s and over our battlefields, and bringing supplies, whether it was ammunition or food, typewriters, medical supplies. He was in the back of the plane, a C-47, with the doors off, and they pushed the supplies out, and the supplies would drop to our soldiers on the ground. Now, again, you might say, well, he was pretty safe. He was in the back of this plane, but he actually flew 1,000 missions over areas that were subject to fire, and also over the Himalayas, or over the hump, as they say. So a very dangerous position with a fully loaded C-47 carrying supplies. He ended up actually crash landing in Burma, and everyone on the plane survived. But it left him with battle fatigue, or what we call PTSD today. He was sent home because of that, but it took him years to recoup. But he did, and he finally graduated from the University of Florida with a degree of engineering, and was awarded 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 5 Air Medals, and 2 Bronze Stars for his service. So he is one of, as I said, one of the most highly decorated individuals, still living in Georgia for sure. And was quite proud that when some of the veterans groups I work with were looking for, when Brian Kemp was elected to Georgia's governorship in 2020, he was asked to be at the inauguration and to pledge allegiance. And he was very, very proud of that moment. And I was very happy to be able to make that happen for him. So those are just 2 of the stories. There are many more. And I call them not just untold stories, but endangered stories at this point. The Americans in World War II, as we said earlier, 16 million men and women served. And when I began this project, we were down to 1 million still living. That was in 2017. And by this point, if you'll see the graph on the top right of your screen, the two little legs there, that is all that is left. Under 250,000 men and women who are still living today and among us. And so their stories are fast disappearing. And I encourage everyone to try to help preserve them. And on a personal note, of the 19 that you saw pictured earlier, 5 of those veterans are still with us today and have become great friends of mine. And I honor them whenever I can. So with that, I will say, I hope I've given you a little bit of flavor for some people who you may not have heard of in their roles in World War II. And I always like to end with this quote because while I learned to respect these people, I didn't realize when we think of George Patton, we think of him as the general's general, or certainly the combat general. But even George Patton recognized the importance of these people. And when he said, all of the real heroes are not storybook combat fighters. Every single man and woman in this army plays a vital role. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book and all my favorite friends. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Any questions for our speaker?
Yeah, I have a question. This is great, and I really appreciate you doing this. I'm wondering what you heard about the reluctance of people that fought in World War II, both frontline and behind the lines, to tell their story. My father was there, as probably many people on the screens, fathers were there, but very, very reluctant through his life to talk about it. I'm just wondering what you believe the core value was behind that reluctance, if you found that reluctance.
Thank you. Yes, in fact, my father was one who never spoke about, even though I finally got him to tell me his story very late in life. It was not unusual. These people had not told their stories. A couple of them finally wrote a few pieces of memoir or have some photo albums they shared. But by and large, they had not told their story. And I think it was really what many of them would say is they didn't think they were doing anything special. And now, of course, we look at them and say, I don't know how many of you know an 18-year-old, high school graduate or barely high school graduate, and can even imagine being put in their shoes in combat in whatever form. But they took it as just a job. They were called on by their country to do it. They dropped their school, their work, they went off to war, and they came home. And it was like, it's over. I don't know the number that actually stayed in or made a career out of the military like my father, but most of them were farmers, and they went back home to farm, or they went back home to get their degree. And so it was like, well, I finished my graduate studies in combat and I just went on to the next thing. But once they were talking, and I always tell this about my father, when I sat him down and we got his papers out, and he was in his 80s by this time. And I said, well, just tell me what you did. And he had his records, and we went through the first one. And he said, oh yes, this mission was when we flew from North Africa to Sicily, or North Africa to Italy. He was a fighter pilot in North Africa. And finally, the wheels started clicking, and he just kept talking. And he would never have guessed, or I would never have guessed, that he would be so delighted that someone cared to ask what he had done and given him the chance to repeat that. And I found that each time I spoke to one, once you got them started, the memories came tumbling out, and they really couldn't help themselves in reliving it. And I always say, I swear my father, who was 5'2", was 5'3" when we finished. He just was that much taller and that much more proud of what he had done. Anyone else? I think
I'm
Ms.
sorry.
Kennedy's on mute.
Okay. My question is, this is a wonderful project. How long did it take you to assemble all the information from these veterans?
Well, it was about the end to end, it was about 3 years, although I guess I should say it's never ending because I'm still talking to veterans today. But I started in mid 2017 when I first met Pete Peterson. And my book came out last year, April 2020. So it was about 3 years total, but finding the veterans actually occurred pretty quickly. Word of mouth. I met one veteran and another, became very active in a number of veterans groups here. And finally, people were calling me up and saying, I found somebody I think you want to talk with. And so it was about maybe 9 months, a year of just doing the interviews. And of course, then the big part, the research took forever, but, because you might talk to a veteran, but the lady who was with the Waves, she's 102 today, and she told me, well, I was the very first class of the Navy Waves. Well, just because I say that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I mean, we're talking about people with memories that are a bit faded. So I did find out, did some research and found out she wasn't the first class, she was the second. And I was going to be the one to break that news to her. Well, luckily, I did a little more research and dug in and found out she was the first official class of those who went on to serve. The very first class were the one they were training the trainers, if you will. So I was much relieved I was able to tell her, yes, well, you were the first official Navy Waves that were deployed.
Thank you.
My mother was in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force of
Yes.
the Royal Air Force.
Oh.
She never spoke about what she did during the war, but I know she was on a secret base. And the reason she never said anything was because she had signed the Official Secrets Act.
Mm.
And it has been years in the making, but I finally figured out some of what she did. The only thing she did ever tell me was her office, her workspace was in a men's lavatory.
Well,
And
she certainly had a tale to tell then.
it was, she did. It's where they processed all the aerial photographs for World War II.
I mentioned the lady. No, yes, go ahead.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, go ahead. What were your when you did research, did you go to a library somewhere, or what did you consult? What were your sources of information?
Absolutely. Well, a number of the military museum libraries are great sources. They have untold troves of books, but I also accumulated my own library. I was going through reading a number of texts. A lot of if no one's aware, the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, where the veterans have been videotaped and are preserved, is open to everyone. So I watched innumerable videos. There's also a series of books that's really the backbone, if you will, of World War II research, and that's the Army's what they call the Green Books. They are exhaustive documents that the military themselves put together at the end of the war and compiled all of the statistics about everything from training to the actual missions to the different specialties. It's a very, very good treasure trove, if you will, sort of the mother of all sources.
Thank you.
Sure.
Roger Snooty, go ahead.
You know, in high schools, we used to do a variety of oral history projects where we would, especially in our social studies programs, and we would try to bring in veterans of World War II to talk. And of course, the Vietnam War, although that was that was pretty current in the 70s, 80s, and when I was teaching and things like that. But from a demographics perspective, who seems to be the most interested in reading these stories at this point in our society today?
Oh gosh. I would say it's largely a male audience, if you want to go in that direction, depending on the story and the type of book. With the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the end of the war last year, I'll say boosted, because I won't say revived. The interest in World War II has not gone down. In fact, if anything, it's resurrected in the last, say, 20 years as we've come of age and have been wanting to know more about what our parents and grandparents did. So there's been a somewhat of a revival or a boost with the end of the World War II. And now the numbers are still, there are untold books coming out about World War II still. It's a very large category of books. And just in case you don't know, theoretically next year, 2022, I believe it's scheduled for, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg are doing the third in their collaboration of films, from Saving Private Ryan to Band of Brothers. And this is going to be from the book Masters of the Air by Donald Miller. And Masters of the Air is going to deal with the 100th Bomb Group, which was the bomber pilots out of England and the Thorpe Abbott's Air Base in England. So everyone is expecting that to sort of boost again interest in 2022. So there's no from novels. You find more novels every day set in World War II, and depending on the subject, a lot of things on espionage. And whenever there's a female lead, there are a lot more women who are reading the fiction about World War II, and I'd say the men more reading nonfiction.
Thank you.
Ms. Simmons, this is President Randy Smith. It's a custom in our club that we have a member respond to our speakers. And today our responder is going to be Colonel Tom Tadson, U.S. Army retired.
Excellent.
Rona, it was a very interesting presentation today, and I certainly appreciate it. I started out in the Army as a buck private in 1967 and retired in 2006 as a lieutenant colonel. I served in Vietnam in 1967, 1968, and 1969. And I learned the importance of those little people in the military. And I carried that lesson with me all the way through. And what I learned was that there are a lot of people in the higher ranks that don't have any appreciation for those small people. And they really do have an important part. Later on in my career as an Army aviator, I had to depend a lot on those people. As a helicopter pilot, I worked all night with my crew chiefs and mechanics to get aircraft flyable again. And without them, it wouldn't have happened. So those people are extremely important. The same thing with medics in Vietnam. When we had mass casualty situations, it was imperative that those people work around the clock. And after World War II, unbeknownst to me, the Army had stripped graves registration people from the table of organization and equipment. When we had significant battles in Vietnam and we killed great numbers of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, when the battle was over, there weren't the same numbers and percentages of grave registration people to take care of those enemy losses. So the same people, meaning us, GIs, had to address those enemy bodies. So not only did we have to fight them and sustain the casualties, but we had to collect them and bury them too. So it was not only traumatic to suffer the casualties of ourselves, but also to address the enemy casualties and dispose of them with some manner of respect and courtesy. So those little people are extremely important. And in all cases, believe me, they're very important. So thank you very much. It was a really great presentation, and I'll be the first in line to buy your book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And mostly I keep in touch with each of the living veterans and their sons and daughters. And just yesterday, the book was reviewed by HNET, Humanities and Social Services, and I always send the reviews directly out to the veterans. And one gentleman who's in his 90s at Carson, he's in New Jersey, and a month or so ago, it's written up in Army Magazine. And I immediately sent him the review, and he was so excited because they mentioned his name in the review. And he said, I'm going upstairs, and there's a colonel who lives upstairs from me, and I'm going up there and show him this review. So it makes their day. I really appreciate it.
That's great. I had, my father served in World War II in the Navy, and I had 5 uncles, an aunt, and a great uncle who served in World War II also. So I appreciate your presentation greatly.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you for your service. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Well,
Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Tom, for your comments, and thank you, Rona, for an excellent program. And we are going to be officially adjourned.